Today I wanted to share with you how I prepare a delicious, healthy, and really cool looking blue swirl sourdough artisan loaf. I love making swirl breads, and recently I made this with the addition of butter toasted oat porridge, and I loved how soft and tender it made the crumb, in addition to adding a rich, nutty, buttery flavor. We'll use the natural coloring of steeped butterfly pea flowers, which are said to have many health benefits, including being packed with antioxidants, alleviating inflammation, and keeping your skin looking youthful. Throughout this video, we'll be following this flowchart. We'll be preparing 2 doughs today, one white and one with water from the steeped flowers. I was inspired to use butterfly pea flower tea in bread from the wonderful Instagrammer Ratty Extraordinary Bite. So after prepping the dough and incorporating the porridge, we'll take the 2 doughs and layer them during the process of lamination. It's always such a fun surprise in the end to see that swirly pattern in the crumb. I've included here the baker's percentages for this recipe. However, I'll be giving the amounts of each ingredient in grams as we go. See the description below this video for more information. If you're just getting started with sourdough, please see my videos on how to make a starter from scratch and how to fully activate your starter and prepare a levain for baking bread. If you'd like to get started with a more basic sourdough loaf, I also have a video for that as well. Links to all these videos are in the description below. And finally, if you're interested in more recipes, methods, and tips, please check out my Instagram page at Foolproof Baking. Alright, let's get started. Before we can autolyse, we must begin by steeping the dried butterfly pea flowers to create a concentrated blue tea. Here are those dried flowers. You can see the dark blue flower top. For really great color, I will separate the flower from the stem. This will give us a beautifully concentrated natural blue coloring for our autolysing dough. You can see how the stems will not be useful here for the purpose of dyeing the water blue. To steep, I will measure out 7 grams dried flower tops into a heat-safe Pyrex measuring cup and top it off with 100 grams boiling water. You can see the water immediately starts turning a lovely blue color. Next, I use a fork to help hydrate the flowers and stir them down until they are all fully submerged. Cover loosely and steep for approximately 20 minutes. After steeping, I like to bring the temperature of the tea down using a couple ice cubes. 2 ice cubes or around 20 grams is perfect. Stir to melt in the ice. The temperature at this point is around 80 degrees Fahrenheit. I'll use a fine mesh strainer to strain out the flowers. If you really press down on the flowers, you can help extract all that beautiful blue water. Now we have what we need to prepare our autolyses. Like I've mentioned, we want to make 2 doughs. For the first, I'm using a mixture of bread and einkorn flours and regular purified water. I like to make 2 times more white dough than blue dough, as this gives me that nice marbled swirly crumb I'm after. The blue dough is composed of the same ratio of flours and is mixed with the blue water. I add a little less water for a slightly lower hydration for the second blue dough, as the butterfly pea flower tea has an effect of making the dough extra extensible. Our goal is for the 2 doughs to have very similar consistencies. Thus, we end up with a white dough with a final hydration of around 80%, while the blue dough has a final hydration of 78%. Using my favorite silicone spatula, I mix the dough well so that no dry flour bits remain. If any dried flour is present at the end of the autolyse, the clumps will be difficult to hydrate later on. Cover and set aside to rest approximately 3 hours. About 30 minutes before adding the Levain to the autolyse, I like to prepare the butter-toasted oat porridge. This porridge recipe is adapted from the book Tivoli Road Baker. Begin by melting 10 grams unsalted butter on medium heat in a small saucepan. Then stir in 36 grams quick or instant oats. They will soak up the butter right away. Toast on medium heat for about 3 to 5 minutes, stirring often. You will see the oats change color, becoming gradually toasted and golden. At this point, you'll want to add milk and water, equal parts, 76 grams each. Use your spatula and stir, allowing the oats to soak up the liquid. I simmer for about 4 to 5 minutes on medium heat, or until the porridge is cooked and absorbed most of the liquid. You don't want to overcook and have too dry a porridge. It's good if the porridge is still fairly wet and loose at the end of cooking. Transfer to a bowl, cover, and let cool about 40 minutes. I try to time my autolyse and Levain to be ready at the same time. See the description below this video for a link that focuses on how I activate my starter and build a Levain before a bake. You can prep your Levain in a variety of ways, but I always prefer to build mine in the early morning, about 2 hours before prepping my autolyse. When fed 1 to 2 to 2 and kept warm, my Levain usually triples in 5 hours. That's how you know it's ready. At this point, my autolysing doughs have been resting 3 hours. This has allowed the dough to develop wonderful extensibility and has given the gluten a nice head start. Both doughs seem about equal in consistency, and both have beautiful window panes. I'm going to divide my activated Levain proportionally into my 2 doughs. Begin by spreading the Levain across the surface of the dough using a wet hand, then manipulate using your fingers to incorporate into the dough. Keep on hand mixing, using your fingertips, until the Levain has become homogeneously incorporated throughout the dough, approximately 3 to 4 minutes. You'll notice I like to lift the dough up every so often and flip over before I continue to mix some more. This is so that I ensure I am getting even incorporation of the Levain. Repeat this with the second blue dough. Spread over the top and mix using the fingertips. This is a very small amount of dough, and mixing only took a couple minutes. Pay attention to the consistency of each dough. I noticed around this time that the blue dough is a little more extensible than the white dough. I'll likely end up adding a touch more water to the first dough when adding the salt in the next step. Ideally, these 2 doughs will be very similar in their consistency by the time we go to laminate them together. Cover and let these rest 30 minutes. Next, we'll focus on adding the sea salt and then immediately after the oat porridge. I use a fine-grained sea salt for sourdough bread. Around 2% works best in my experience. I'll divide the sea salt proportionally, just sprinkle directly on top of each of the doughs. Using a wet hand, begin by dimpling the salt into the dough and then begin working the dough, again with the fingertips, so that the salt begins to get incorporated. Continue to mix and fold the dough over itself so that you ensure the salt is evenly spread throughout. I noticed after a little bit that the dough felt a little overly strong, as I mentioned earlier, so to increase the extensibility a bit, I went ahead and added another 5 grams water. For this first dough, including the incorporation of the additional water, it took me approximately 5 minutes of hand mixing. Repeat this with the second blue dough. I was happy to note that the consistency was now very similar to the first dough. Overall, because there's so little dough we're working with, the hand mixing for this one only took about 2 to 3 minutes before the salt was fully incorporated. Immediately after finishing with the sea salt, and before the dough has time to rest, I like to gently fold in the porridge. The porridge has cooled at this point to room temperature, but I noticed that it was a little thick and dry for my liking. I went ahead and worked in another 15 grams of water, and that seemed to thin it out well enough. I'll take 66 grams of this porridge and divide it proportionally. To fold the porridge in, I take a little bit at a time and blot the top of the dough with little bits of the porridge. Helps having the porridge thinned out a little, as you can see. Try to get it fairly evenly spread out, and then gently lift up the edge of the dough and fold it back on top of itself. Add a little more porridge and do another fold. And keep doing this until the porridge seems pretty well dispersed into the dough. Do not overwork the dough at this point. There will be more folds throughout the rest of the bulk. I rounded off the ball of dough in the bowl to clean it up a little bit here. Repeat the same process with the second blue dough, blotting the surface of the dough with bits of porridge and then folding over on itself until the porridge is all incorporated. I will note that everything is feeling very nice at this time. Neither doughs seem overly extensible, and I can tell when I pull on the dough that they are beginning to develop some early strength. We are on the right track. Cover the doughs and let them rest 30 minutes. Next, we will do a simple fold on the counter to see how the dough is coming along and to organize the dough a bit before we do lamination. I'll lightly mist the counter with a bit of water, not too much, and with a wet hand scrape the sides of the dough from the bowl and tip it out upside down onto the countertop. Use a wetted bench knife to help lift the top section of the dough from the counter and stretch and pull the dough out and then back on top of itself. Repeat the exercise with the other 3 sides of the dough. You can see how silky the dough appears at this stage. It's still very extensible, but it is already getting stronger. After the final fold, turn the dough ball over and round it off on the counter before returning to the bowl. You can repeat this series of folds with the blue dough as well. Round off, return the blue dough to the bowl, and cover. Let these dough balls rest for about 30 minutes. Next, we'll laminate the 2 doughs together. Both doughs are looking smooth and well rested. We'll mist the counter with some water, not too much. We don't want the dough swimming on the countertop. Tip the first dough out and begin gently stretching the dough outwards from the center to the edge. Don't pull so hard that the dough tears. Respect the dough, but at the same time you will want to pull on it enough to get it into a rough rectangular shape. Repeat with the second blue dough. Remember, there is less dough here and it will not stretch to the same size as the larger white dough. Pick up the blue dough and lay it directly on top of the white dough. Work quickly to try to evenly spread the dough on top. Sometimes this works better than others. If it doesn't lay perfectly on top, you can pick up the edges and encourage the dough to lay more evenly across the top. At this point, I'll stretch the dough out a little bit more all around so that it becomes a bit thinner, but try to keep it rectangular in shape. Now, lift one side of the rectangle and fold it in on itself to the center section. Lift the other side and lay it directly on top of the center section. Fold down the top and then fold the bottom section up to complete the lamination. Grab a clean, square dish with low sides if you have one, and transfer the dough to the clean dish. Cover and let rest about 75 minutes around 73 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit. I like to do only 2 coil folds for this particular recipe, as I think it helps prevent the 2 layers from overly blending. You must plan ahead to know how strong your dough will be, for if it is too overly extensible, you will need to add in more folds, and the marbled effect may be lost, though you should still get a very nice blue coloring of the loaf. If you are struggling with overly extensible dough, consider cutting the hydration of each of these doughs so that fewer coil folds are necessary. I wanted to also add that temperature during the bulk stage is very important. I like to keep my dough bulking around 73 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit, but if your dough is warmer or cooler, you'll have to play with the length of bulk and the timing of these folds. Please see my other video on open crumb sourdough if you'd like a more detailed explanation of temperature, dough strength, and bulk fermentation. It's now been 75 minutes since laminating, and you can see that the dough has settled down during the first rest period. It has not increased much in volume yet, which is normal at this stage of the bulk. Using wetted hands, reach in and under the dough. Pull back on the dough, allowing it to release from the bottom of the dish and curl back on itself. As this is the first coil fold, it may take multiple pulls to release all the dough from the bottom of the dish. That is fine. Do the same to the other side of the dough, popping any large air pockets you encounter along the way. Continue to the sides of the dough and perform the same coil folds there as well. You will want to work as gently and symmetrically as you can, as these folds give the dough not only strength but also lots of structure. Cover the dough and let rest another 75 minutes. Now on to the second and final coil fold. The dough has relaxed a bit in the dish since the first fold. You can see it is flattened out. There is a little bit of rise in volume by this point, which is to be expected. We'll do another set of folds around the dough using wetted hands. Note that the dough has increased in strength a bit as compared to that first set of coil folds. Remember to focus on the symmetry of the dough during this final fold especially. We can hopefully skip the pre-shape if we structure the dough well enough during this step. Continue to pop any large visible bubbles. These are not fermentation bubbles. These are pockets of air introduced during the earlier folds and lamination and could cause caverns in your dough if you do not eliminate them. I have been monitoring the temperature throughout bulk, hovering around 74 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit, and I'll show you now how I check the internal dough temp using a thermometer. I record this measure in my notebook. It's best to record dough temp immediately following the coil folds, which can help distribute the temperature more evenly. If the dough is running a little warm, you may want to decrease the total bulk period, and if it's running a little cool, you may want to increase the bulk period. But for a dough at 74 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit like this one, I tend to have the best results with a 6-hour bulk period. Cover and we'll let sit untouched until the end of the bulk. It has now been 6 hours since adding the Levain, and the dough is looking so nice and proofy. You should see that your dough is rising both vertically as well as it is spreading horizontally in the dish. I will orient the dough to choose a bottom and sprinkle on some flour to prevent the dough from sticking as it releases from the dish. Sprinkle the countertop with a liberal amount of flour as well, and use your floured fingers to help release the top of the dough from the dish. Flip the dish over and let the dough release on its own. Now use your bench knife to tuck the flour around the sides of the dough and then discard the excess flour from the counter. Shape the dough into a rough rectangular shape. Once you achieve the right shape with the dough, using the aid of a bench knife, pick up, gently pull outwards, and then fold one side flap of the dough back onto itself into the center. Repeat this same thing with the other side flap. You can gently pat the dough down to degas any very large air bubbles as you go. Now, using a floured hand, roll up the dough from the top down, using your thumbs to tuck in the dough into itself. This will help to create a more taut surface as you roll. Finally, use your fingers to help seal the seam at the bottom of the shaped dough. I like to then pinch together the seams at the sides of the dough ball as well. Using brown rice flour to help with stickiness, lightly flour the top of the dough ball. Ready your banneton and gently flip the dough ball over so that the top of the dough is now on the bottom, and transfer gently to the banneton. We will now cover the dough and let rest approximately 15 to 20 minutes at room temperature before transferring to the cold refrigerator for an overnight cold retard. Throughout the bulk period, the dough has risen approximately 50% in volume. This corresponds to a pretty fully fermented dough. Because we've pushed the bulk so far, I don't wish for the dough to rise much more, or it will become over-fermented or overproofed. I set my fridge to a very cold 38 degrees Fahrenheit, which essentially prevents any further rise. If your fridge is warmer than 40 degrees Fahrenheit, I recommend cutting your bulk back by a little bit to account for any additional fermentation and proofing that will take place during your overnight retard. Now it's the next morning, and I've been preheating the oven for about an hour at 500 degrees Fahrenheit. I like to bake my dough straight from the fridge for max oven spring. The dough is looking lovely after the overnight rest. I'll sprinkle on a little bit of semolina flour to prevent any sticking to the parchment, and then carefully tip out the dough so that the top of the dough is now oriented upright again. Do this in whatever way you find most easy. I like to use my hand to flip over and position the dough onto a dough peel so that I can easily move it into the oven. Then, using a curved razor attached to a lame, I'll make a single slash in the dough right across the top, approximately a ½ inch deep and at a 45-degree angle. This allows a space for the dough to spring in the oven and release steam in the process. I've mentioned that my oven has been preheating at 500 degrees Fahrenheit for about an hour. This is my ideal oven setup as I've described previously. I make use of a thick baking stone, a broiling tray full of lava rocks positioned slightly off to the side of the stone, ice cubes that I add just after loading my dough, and a jumbo roaster lid that is offset over the stone to allow steam to enter after splashing on a cup of hot water onto the lava rocks. Close the door after loading everything and bake for 20 minutes at 500 degrees Fahrenheit. Now that special moment. Open the door and remove the roaster lid. I'm really liking the oven spring on this loaf. It's only halfway done baking at this point, so we'll actually get it back into the oven and continue baking another 20 minutes at a slightly lower 450 degrees Fahrenheit, or until it's nicely caramelized and sounds hollow when tapped on the bottom. So here is that final loaf. You've just put in a lot of work for this beauty so you can admire the fruits of your labor. It looks and smells wonderful. Love the oven spring and even shape overall. I'll let it cool, try to let it cool, for about 2 hours before slicing it up. Here I am trying my best to slice evenly, nice and crusty. And that wonderful surprise inside. Every swirl pattern is different each and every time. I'm very happy with this swirly marbling. The crust is so thin and crackly. The crumb is enticingly soft and tender, very creamy. Flavor is spot on, nutty, buttery, and sweet. This is definitely one of my very favorite recipes. Hope you enjoyed watching, and please comment below if you try this one out and let me know how it goes. Hopefully you enjoy making this loaf and eating it as much as I do. If you enjoyed this video, please check out my others here on YouTube, as well as my Instagram at Foolproof Baking, where you'll find other recipes, methods, and tips. Happy baking!